Are you struggling with depression? Just looking for multiple resources on how you can fix, heal, work through, feel better from your depression? Honestly, I have struggled with depression before I had a reason to be depressed. And as I was going through lots of grief and trauma, you can see the multiple pictures behind me. These are my children and my husband who I have lost. And I went through this trauma over the course of 20 years. And I really have a much better handle on my depression. Like many of you, people with depression are often predisposed, or it comes up in adolescence, early adulthood, or maybe something has happened in your life right now and all of a sudden you are feeling depressed. We often, when we are going through YouTube channels, we are looking for 6 things. If I just do these 6 things, I can fix my depression. I do have 6 things. And if you work on these 6 things, you will feel better. But if you've been struggling with this depression for long enough, you know that it's complicated. But you will learn from my story, and you will learn from these 6 things. See, I'm also a psychiatric nurse practitioner who has been through grief and trauma successfully, if you can use that word. And these 6 things actually boil down to 2 categories: expectations and thoughts. So let's dive in. Number 1 is your expectation of yourself. Do you expect yourself to be happy and joyful all the time and super productive? I don't expect to be happy and joyous all the time, but I'll tell you, I really struggle with that productivity. If I'm not productive, if I'm not moving forward in something, I feel down, I feel depressed. And so in this first part, I want you to think of, what are your expectations of yourself? Because we need to give ourselves grace. So think about, and when I say think about, I oftentimes mean stop and write it down, because what we write down kind of gives validity, and then we can also pour into it reality or truth. So I want you to write down your expectations of yourself. What are your expectations of yourself? And it might be a list of 3 to 5 things. If you're feeling it, you might actually list 10 things that you expect of yourself. I don't want you to go overboard. I want these to be things that you often expect of yourself. Now, take that list and narrow it down to the ones that come up all the time. For me, is productivity. It is definitely my number 1. I want to be happy, and I've been able to work through and have moments in my life that I'm happy. Now, after you've written down those words, what you expect of yourself, how often do you give yourself grace, forgiveness, that you're not doing those things all the time? Probably not enough. So that number 1 is fixing or changing the expectations of yourself. Let's move on to number 2. Expectations of others. Remember, I said the first 3 would be expectations. What are your expectations of the important people in your life? I love to give my spouse as an example, especially when we were together going through the grieving process of our children. And I expected him to do things similar to me. I expected him to be angry with God, and that wasn't his story. I expected him to show this outward depression. And so when he wasn't meeting that expectation, I thought there was something wrong with me. So having expectations of others also impacts our depression. So, your significant other is an example of that. But also expectations of others, how they will respond to me. So I have created a grief documentary, and it is very vulnerable, very raw. And I often sit in an audience with other people watching it for the first time. And my expectation is for there to be a reverence to my vulnerability. And sometimes it hasn't. Like the next film at a film festival is a mockumentary or a comedy skit. And hurts my vulnerability or feeds my depression. So you see how expectations of others can do that. The third expectation is of life. I honestly thought that because I have dealt with these big losses, my 3 children dying, and I remember 2 very distinct moments where after Reggie's death, my house shifted and a huge crack. And a very similar thing happened after Maya's death. After my husband's death. And, it's a big financial thing. I have to spend lots of money to stabilize the house. And I thought, I've been through these big problems. I shouldn't have to deal with these kind of problems. And I also think of road rage. Have you ever just been struggling with your own problems and you have normal life problems, like somebody cutting you off in traffic, getting into a traffic jam and now you're going to be late, getting called out or in trouble at work, normal everyday life problems you're still experiencing even though you're fighting your depression. Sometimes those things make you want to give up. Don't give up. And if, I always have to put this in there. If you ever feel like giving up to the point of suicidal thoughts, that requires professional intervention. But in general, working through your depression and these 6 things. So we talked about the 3 expectations. Now let's go into your thoughts. Many people struggle with thoughts and many people feel like they can't control their thoughts. And I have 2 points about that. One, if you truly are trying to control your thoughts, for example, I spent some time with a young adult yesterday who does meditation, does other energy work, and really does a lot of coping skills for her anxiety. And it helps in the moment, but she doesn't feel like she can control her thoughts. That might need professional intervention. But in general, we should be able to control our thoughts. So we have the 3 expectations. Now the number 4 is your thoughts about yourself. And there is tons of self-development, self-help resources out there about the way you talk to yourself. Do you tell yourself what an amazing person you are? Or do you say things like, I'm worthless? Making this a priority can change your life. And I could go on here forever, but you get the point. There's things like thought stopping. You put a rubber band on your wrist and every time you have a negative thought about yourself, you pop that. You must replace the negative thoughts with positive thoughts and they have to be realistic. So if you're telling yourself, I'm worthless, and someone says, you need to tell yourself you're amazing, and you don't actually think you're amazing, it's not going to work. I can tell you what I do, but you have to find what works for you. I often use the word above average. I struggle with, my looks, my weight, and how smart I am. Those are the 3 things that have been coming up for me since I was a teenager. And smarts really gets me because I'm not academically very smart. Like in high school, I took the SATs, didn't do well. I had to choose a graduate school that would give an exception to the graduate entrance exam because I don't do well in those situations. I can't read and answer questions. And so for many, many years, I have thought I wasn't smart. I realize now, as I've been through a journey and I'm sharing, I realize what my superpowers are. And in the big scheme of things, I am above average in my smartness. Okay. Now that wouldn't come out in a test, but I have a gift. I have a superpower of vulnerability. These are my stories. Don't take this on. What is your replacement for those negative thoughts that's realistic and real to you, that you know about yourself? We all have positive things about us, but we unfortunately focus too much on the negative. And when we focus on that negative, we feed in to that negative. So number 5 is your anxious thoughts. And this is another one of my pet peeves. People always say, don't be anxious. And people that are anxious are like, how can you not be anxious? Anxiety can actually be productive. So if you look at like a scale of 0 to 10, and 10 being that panic anxiety, right? And 7 being severe anxiety that makes you want to avoid situations. 4 or 5 is that moderate anxiety. A lot of people live in 4 to 5 all the time. And 0 is no anxiety. Think about, where are you on that scale on a regular basis? When you're working on your anxious thoughts, you're not going to get rid of them. Anxiety is good. I can give you an example of, I was about to do a pretty significant speech, and I don't typically get anxious, but I was anxious about this particular speech. Now, if I wasn't anxious at all, I wouldn't have prepared, and it wouldn't have went well without preparation in this particular situation, because you couldn't just wing it. So mild anxiety, that 0, 1 to 3, 4, actually allows you to be productive. So if you are at a 4 or 5 anxiety level, you're not trying to get rid of your anxiety. You're just trying to move it over to a 2, 3 so that you can be productive in that anxiety. Because what happens is you tell yourself, I'm not supposed to be anxious. And when you focus on something you're not supposed to be doing, what happens? It gets worse. Right? So anxiety is a continuum that you're just trying to decrease the intensity. You're not trying to get rid of those thoughts. So number 5 is controlling your anxious thoughts. Number 6 is also thoughts, and it's controlling your distorted thoughts. We all have a tendency to distorted thoughts. We may think that they are real, but I want to talk about them a little bit so that you get this idea that, that's not a healthy thought pattern, and how can I change that thought pattern? So a very common example of distorted thought is black and white thinking. All or nothing. Everything is black or white. And we see this in politics. I don't talk politics here, but we see this. There's these extremes, and if you believe this way, it's 100% true, rather than the reality that both sides could have some truth to them. And so being able to integrate presumably opposite thoughts is a very healthy way to think, okay? So black and white thinking is a distorted thought process. Another example might be with your significant other. They didn't call me when they got home from work, or they didn't do such and such. Going back to expectations, but how do you respond? The distorted thought of black and white is, he or she doesn't love me. When we create this behavior equals this, right? Overgeneralization, and the example of me feeling like I'm not smart, right? When you take a standardized test and you don't do well on a standardized test, and you overgeneralize that means that I'm not smart, that's a distorted thought. Catastrophizing, right? If I don't get this job, I will lose my house, I will lose this. Thinking the worst case scenario often, right? Now, it's okay to have plan Bs for worst case scenarios, right? But catastrophizing is like worst case scenario, and there's not going to ever be a way out, right? That's another type of distorted thinking. Mind reading. Somebody is rude to you at the store, or one of your coworkers is rude to you, or rolls their eyes, or does something, and you think, that person doesn't like me. Like, you go to a negative about yourself, you're mind reading, you're interpreting, you're assuming that behavior means that he or she doesn't like you, right? So these are all distorted thinking. If you are experiencing clinical depression that these things that I said mean nothing, like you are like, I can't, please seek professional help. But let's review these 6. The first 3 are expectations of self, expectations of others, and expectations of life problems. Then we have number 4 is thoughts about yourself. Number 5, controlling those anxious thoughts. And number 6, controlling those distorted thoughts. So you can be stronger and feel more in control of your depression. We'd love for you to keep watching. Watch this video on feeling down when you're not productive. I kind of give some examples for myself and just really continue on that journey.